Now we would like to open the floor for questions. If somebody has a question, please raise your hand and make sure you introduce yourself and say the institution you are representing. Okay. To give you some time to actually think about, I would like to start if we can actually, if both of you would like to answer the couple of questions that Joe asked at the very end.
If I may, I will start with. If I may, I will start with questions related to differences in the insurance scheme in the EU and in the US. First of all, as it was already mentioned by Jesus Zorilla, I think it is important to stress that direct payments, which are paid per hectare of agricultural land, which is kept in good agricultural conditions, play the role of a so-called safety net. So farmers have some insurance of their income independently on the situation, or I would say on the market, and also if there are some unexpected events like, for example, drought or flood. But of course, there is in the EU a possibility to participate in insurance scheme, which are available on commercial basis and which are available on the voluntary basis to farmers. More developed scheme is mostly related to the insurance of crops against flood or low temperature or also drought. There is a very little insurance related to the income. What we are going to improve in new period, we are going to ask member states to prepare the framework for insurance to all farmers. And in the proposal we are just submitted, the insurance is we like to that will be obligatory to be prepared by member states, but still voluntary to farmers. So we have also to be aware that in the EU we have many very small farms. So of course in a certain region of the EU, the average farm area is 50 to 100 or close to this level, but there are also farms with very small area like 10-20 hectares in the Eastern and Central Europe. So these small farmers, very often they have also other source of income, and they quite reluctant, to pay for insurance. This is why these instruments are not so well developed in the EU.
Let me address the the point Joe made about the budget pressures, and I think certainly farm bills are under lots of different political dynamics, and a couple of those are the concerns within Congress at the time, as well as the economics on the farm. And so you could map out some of those concerns when we went to more decoupled payments back in the 90s, when we went away from some of that decoupling, when we had high prices in a couple previous farm bills. And I think the politics this time, well, I would have expected more economic pressure to find savings in the farm bill this time. I think it was captured in the dynamics of a Congress that maybe doesn't care as much about budget deficits as it has at one time, and tough, challenging economics on the farm. It's certainly much more challenging to pull support away when we have folks that are seeing a lot lower prices and tougher economics. And so I think without the ability to exactly predict when the next farm bill or the next farm bill, what the dynamics will be at that time, I think those are significant drivers. I also think, and it really the conversation around saving dollars happened in part around an effort to decrease the subsidy for crop insurance. And I think it shows the support of Congress for crop insurance shows great support within Congress and within the ag community for a private-public partnership to manage risk, and a preference of that over ad hoc disasters or other approaches. And so therefore, while there was an effort to reduce costs there, it was a long ways away from having much legs in the end. And so I don't know where that effort will show in the future. Certainly the bulk of the other dollars within agriculture programs is around environmental support. So as we look at cost share for conservation programs, I think that's a fairly bulletproof kind of area where there's a large contingency of folks that would like to see that grow without the ability to know where the dollars come from. So I think it's unlikely to see much of a reduction in that area in the future as well.
If I may add a few words about the budget issue, because I think that there's a different situation in the EU and in the US. The construction of the European budget is that we cannot have any euro of deficit. So our payments cannot be higher than commitments. And this is why the budget is so important, and there are a lot of constraints on that. What is going now, we are asking, as I already presented, we are asking more from farmers to deliver not only on food security, but also on climate change and environment. So we have a smaller budget, in general 5% less according to the EU Commission proposal, which is still under discussion, but more requests to farmers to deliver on environment and other societal challenges. How to achieve this? I think that one of the important elements of solution is innovation and research. And the only part of the budget which is increasing is related to the innovation of and research. So in the budget proposal, we have almost twice more money for research and innovation in agriculture, food, and also bioeconomy. 10 billion euro for 7 years. Of course, we are talking here about the European budget, common budget, but on research and innovation, member states can, of course, spend their own money from national budget. But the CAP has a very strong elements which and discipline. So we have a common policy. So we finance measures from common budget.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Shanken.
Well, thank you very much. I was in Minnesota 33 years ago. I visited lots of rural areas. It was very vibrant, you know, the small towns, small cities. Now, similarly, I was in Europe about 20-something years ago, in Netherlands, Belgium, and so on. I also visited lots of rural areas. But I have not heard about you, whether it's common agriculture policy or U.S. farm bills have affected rural areas for the last 2 or 3 decades. Let's say Northern Iowa, Minnesota, has the farmers benefited from the policy, or we still see the out migration from rural areas to urban areas, so rural areas has become empty. I don't know. So maybe you could also think of the future agriculture policy and its impact on rural areas. You know, it's a space for living, space for jobs, space for even attracting people back from big cities like Minneapolis or Twin Cities or even New York. Similarly in Europe, I wanted to hear from you the impact on rural areas.
Thank you for this question. I didn't raise this issue, but it's extremely important. We call this second pillar rural development support, which we continue for several years now. And this support is co-financed from EU member states' money. So there are different measures possible. First of all, to invest in farms to increase the competitiveness of the farm. Also to increase the environmental performance of farms by, for example, investment in machinery equipment which reduce the negative income of farming on the environment. There is also a possibility to use the rural development money for infrastructure investment, which is very well seen in the new member states, in the eastern part of Europe, where there are a lot of, for example, roads were subsidized through European money. And effects are, I think it's very clear. It's not only our analysis show this, but also, for example, World Bank report of last year showed that, first of all, CAP, especially second pillar, help to reduce poverty on rural areas. The reduction of poverty is substantial thanks of the CAP. And also all this infrastructural investment, for example, on broadband, the quick high-speed internet connection helps to attract people to invest in rural areas. And in some member states, we show that, during especially difficulties in the urban zones, there is a more and more interest to work in the rural areas and through connection to internet to be active. So I think that the results are already there, but still we need to continue with this policy, and this is why there is a strong demand for this kind of measure. So we are not yet finalizing this project, but it's very promising results which we can now comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some real similarities in the way that that we look at rural areas. We certainly, our agricultural support is designed to have an impact on rural areas, because if farmers aren't profitable, rural areas absolutely suffer. We both are struggling with the loss of some of our farmers. We have less farmers.
5% is younger than 35.
And yes, and it's a small number of young farmers out there. Although I think in some of our measures we don't capture multi-farmer generations. So we may have the person who's running that farm is 65 years old, but they've got 2 generations younger that are helping on that farm as well. But I still think overall the approach is we lose some of those farms, the capacity to run larger operations continues to grow. The need for efficiency means we have less farmers. Many of our input suppliers and others that are part of those rural communities also scale, and so we continue to see some erosion in those rural areas. While the economics of the farm is awful important, you don't sell anything unless you have some profitability out there. That's not enough. One of the programs that is strongly supported is a rural development program within USDA, providing loans for many of the rural infrastructures. It's community projects that are there, from fire stations to water treatment plants and other even independent small businesses there that can find themselves affording themselves of some of those loans. It's tough. It's a big country, and it's challenging to be everywhere and have that impact. We have seen pockets of significant growth where we've added a crop, where we've put a biorefinery for an ethanol project. And in those communities, we've actually seen significant growth in some of those communities in those rural areas because of agriculture. But those are pockets. There are hundreds of places rather than tens of thousands of places out there. And so that effort to find innovation through broadband, through the use of digital technology, we still struggle with digital availability, broadband in those areas. So it's going to be an increasing amount of effort from USDA now to improve broadband capacity, because we believe there's innovation not only to make farms more profitable, but to create businesses in rural areas, helping those farms, but maybe actually even doing some of the work a long ways away if they can telework and they can do it from an area they'd like to be in. Maybe one of the spouses is on a farm or in a small business and the other can have another job, but you need to be able to have access. And we struggle with that in some of our areas out there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have other questions? Yes. Thank you. Please remember to introduce yourselves so the people that are online can actually know they're asking.
Thank you. I'm Jeff Cockfield, and I'm from the University of Southern Queensland in Australia, and at the moment Kansas State University. I just wanted to pursue the issue just raised, and I was wondering from our two guests comment on, is it really time we had a more open conversation about the reduction in the number of farmers? Because, as you both know, farm organisations really try to maintain farm numbers and want policies to do so. But as far as I know, no policies in the developed world have stopped that structural adjustment in agriculture. And I wonder whether we should more explicitly talk about the fact that we seem to be inevitably on a path for fewer farmers.
Can we take the three questions that we have there before we...
I'm Ragnar Øygard, visiting here at IFPRI from Norwegian University of Life Sciences. We heard that global climate change is an important issue in EU ag policy. So I would be interested in hearing to what extent is climate change mitigation and adaptation part of US ag policy?
Hi, my name is Julie Kurtz. I'm here at IFPRI. I was wondering about disparities between how subsidy programs are distributed to different farming populations between the US and Europe. So taking, for example, the crop insurance program, which is over $40 billion, and it only actually reaches less than a third of US farmers. So I was wondering about the farming population that is left out, and if that reality is true in the US as it is in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. You don't have to answer everything, but if you want to pick.
I would like to start with this first question concerning the reduction of number of farmers on rural areas. I think that this process is going on. It's visible. There is a tendency of concentration of agriculture production in Europe, especially if we look at number of farms in new member states, which is very high, now is going down. But what is important that we of course we know that to keep competitiveness of farms, it's very difficult, to in certain production. It's impossible to improve the competitiveness without increase of farms area. But our policy is, of course, not focusing on keep agricultural job. I mentioned about 22 jobs supported by agriculture by farmers, but I mentioned also that 44 jobs are supported in broader terms. And what is, I would say, positive about the CAP first and second pillar is that during last years we observed the increase of share of employment on rural areas. It doesn't mean that there is more farmers. On the contrary, the number of farmers is going down, but at the same time there are jobs on rural areas related not necessarily only to agriculture, because we have a lot of programs. I didn't mention many of them, but on environmental issues, on short food supply chain, the quality scheme, and there is an opportunity to find a job also outside of agriculture in rural zones, and our policy shows that there is this positive trend. So on one hand, indeed, the number of farmers will be reduced. But the important thing is also the speed of the reduction. Without our policy, probably these changes will go much quicker than with the policy we apply. But there is, of course, also generational change. So I think that the approach of old farmers to land is different than young farmers who are mostly entrepreneur. And I think that with a change of generation, we have also different type of farming activity and different approach to land. If I can also at the same time to say a few words about this discrepancy of the support. Of course, in our policy, first pillar, the direct payments are provided almost to all farmers who fulfill certain number of requirements. So, in principle, farmers who have even 1 hectare in some member states or more, they can receive direct payments. For rural development, there is a voluntary scheme, so it depends of their activity and interest. So the programs are very popular, but do not cover all farmers, of course. In current system of support from first pillar, we pay per hectare, but with the possibility of reducing payment for big farms. So there is a so-called voluntary capping, which member states can introduce, but for new programming period, we would like to improve distribution of direct payments to farmers, and Commission proposal is to introduce compulsory capping on the level of 100,000 euro per farm, and degressive payments for farmers who received between 60 and 100,000 euro per farm. So we can say that there will be more possibility to member states to increase better distribution of payments for farmers. And I already mentioned very briefly that the special attention we pay to young farmers for first installment of young farmers, and also from the point of view of subsidies to encourage them to stay in farm sector. We provide a little bit the possibility to top up direct payments to young farmers only. The young farmers, those who are not older than 40 years in the EU.
Let me hit a couple of those, and certainly as we talk about climate change, since our approach mostly on the conservation side is voluntary programs, I do not see a regulatory climate change approach within U.S. agriculture right now. But as we talk about why folks participate in that program, we have folks come for all different reasons. And certainly we have folks that are coming because of their personal interest in being able to store carbon. A lot of focus on soil health, and inherently that is the opportunity to be able to store carbon for the good of that land and for that production, but it's also the larger good as far as being able to be a carbon sink. So it's not an inherent driver. It's more a passive interest by many folks. We'll see what the next Congress does, but it's not a inherent part of the farm policy process right now, certainly in a regulatory way. And then crop insurance and the availability of crop insurance. And Joe probably has these numbers memorized a lot better than I do, but we have, I believe, 551 crops now. There's crop insurance is available for. We spend about $6 billion in subsidies of the $10 billion of premium. So I'd love to be able to understand exactly the $40 billion number. And then many of the places where we have crop insurance available, we have very high uses. But many of the total number of producers out there are very small producers and livestock producers where there's limited availability for a crop insurance kind of coverage. So for those that have it available, we have significant uses. We always struggle with specialty crops, with crops of very diverse operations. We have whole farm insurance and some other insurance that are designed to be able to help those with complex operations that manage a lot of their own risk, but still need some risk coverage protection. But in our largest commodities, that's the easiest ones to write for. We have very high participation in those.
Thank you very much, both of you. And now Joe also wants to say something, to add something to this.
Sure. No, and let me follow up on the crop insurance issue. Just to say, you're exactly right. They're generally available. I think 85% or so of crop value is insured, or at least, I shouldn't say 85% of crop value is insured, but the participation covers about 85% of crop value. So in particular, if you look at the major row crops, you have participation rates there in terms of area insured on the order of 90% or even higher. Where you don't see is actually farmers. And there, the number of farmers is a much smaller number, normally around 30% or 35%, which seems really low until you remember what the structure of agriculture looks like in the U.S. and the fact that the U.S. considers a farm any operation that could grow $1,000 or more. So there's a lot of really small entities that are classified as farms, but really contribute very little in terms of actual production. And moreover, most of their income is from off the farm. So for them, even a generously subsidized program just doesn't make much sense to insure their crops. But if you look at generally where most of the crops are grown, that is where you see pretty high participation. And again, it in terms of overall subsidies runs somewhere in the order of $8 to $9 billion a year. So those subsidies are quite generous, which do encourage a lot of people to participate. And then the other thing on climate smart agriculture, I think, you know, you're right, a lot of the conservation programs actually are, I think, what people would consider climate smart. And then the other thing that we don't typically think of very much in terms of a farm bill, because we pay for all of this in annual appropriations, but that's research and development, which again, I think is probably one of the biggest contributors to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, or at least, I shouldn't say reduction, but making production far more efficient relative to carbon emissions. And that, unfortunately, I think R&D, just like we lament productivity gains slowing and other things, I think it's too bad we can't take some of these more generous price and income support programs and put those into R&D for those purposes. But
Thank you, Joe. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Rajul?
Rajul Pandey-Loach at IFPRI. This is an absolutely fascinating panel. I've heard you talk a lot about farm policy, agricultural policy, and environmental and climate change. But another looming threat is that of poor health and malnutrition. And I haven't heard you talk about how your agricultural policies or farm policies are evolving to deliver more nutritious foods at more affordable prices to consumers, or how to deliver better health outcomes. And I'm curious, do you see that evolution taking place, or how do you see it taking place? Thank you.
I think there is some, although my best experience is with those programs directly looking at agriculture. There have been constant tensions of where our support prices are with increased effort to look at fruits and vegetables and increase some support in a very complex economic environment in those areas. Certainly feeding programs, the SNAP program within USDA, there's a lot of intricacies there and focus on what's supported and what shouldn't be supported. That continues to evolve. More interest in reducing food waste as well, trying to make sure that the food that's out there gets to somebody that can use it. So there are pieces of it. I'm not as familiar maybe as some in what those are actually impacting, but there's some conversation, probably not as much conversation as most would like.
Yes, I think that concerning CAP, first of all, we do already quite a lot to address the issue of, I mentioned food security, but also food safety, and also to help to develop the new standard of nutrition. For example, in our policy, we support so-called school scheme. It means we subsidize milk and fruits and vegetables, so, which are provided to children in the school. We co-finance this from the European budget and with member states. The program is not very big because it's only 150 million euro yearly, but it's extremely positive. There is a very good feedback from this program, and member states are happy to continue. For next period, as I already mentioned, the idea is to give member states more flexibility to decide what kind of goal, what kind of results they have to achieve concerning 9 European level objectives. And in this objective, we have 3 societal objectives related also to food. For example, now there's an issue of antimicrobial resistance. So member states can use these tools to achieve something more on that. There is, of course, the question of reduction of use of chemicals in food production and pesticides, for example. So we can reduce this through precision agriculture, for example. There's one of the area which is developed, but also other new possibilities will exist thanks of this more flexible model of the implementation of the CAP. You mentioned affordable food. I think that, you know, on that, our policy, which was introduced after the Second World War, achieved a lot, because, you know, now the share of budget in the EU families spent for food is relatively very low, and is going down every year. So the food is affordable, and also not only food, but high quality food. So this is why we pay a lot of attention to the quality program, geographical indications, organic food. We provide special support for organic producers, because it's clear that they have additional costs or income forgone because of this method of production, which is very good for environment but not very good for competitiveness. So these programs are developed very well, and this is one of the key elements of the future. With new emphasis that it is to member states to prepare the strategic plan, and on the basis of, you know, what are European objectives, and I already mentioned that 3 are societal objectives. So I think that we are on good way to achieve more than even in current period on these societal challenges.
Thank you very much, and also for reminding us that the agricultural sector is not the only thing it matters. It's the whole rural, how the agricultural sector affects the rural and the whole food systems with this. And also for emphasizing that I think that one of the preoccupations that they have with the new discussion about the CAP 2020 is the degree of freedom that you're giving the members to actually, the EU members, to deal with the 9 objectives that you're saying, but you gave us a very good explanation of that there are some also limitations on what they could be doing, so that they will keep working towards the climate change and the environmental regulations that the EU is really committed to do so. We don't have too many minutes, so I would like to give the discussants maybe a last opportunity to comment on something that they, no? Joe, do you want something to say, or?
Joe can't comment this one. No, I just want to thank both of you for coming. This has really been instructive. Undersecretary Norther, you have my sympathy. I think as soon as this bill's done, you're going to have to spend about a year and a half getting all those rules out. So I've been there. But thanks so much.
All right. No, we're not, so before, do you want to say something else, or we're all, last chance?
Thanks for this opportunity to participate in this panel. And I think that this panel shows that despite of differences between us, there is a lot of issues on which we can work together to achieve more than now. So I'm rather optimistic that we'll be able, to, if we continue good exchange of views and also cooperation on different forums, not only on research and innovation, but also on policy issue, we can do more together. So thank you for this opportunity.
And let me add as well, thank you all for being here and your interest. Anybody that's watching this later as well for taking time. I would argue that policy is absolutely created by participation. And all these policies as we go forward are influenceable by all of you. So it's important to take time to understand, to ask questions, to engage. Those that engage have an undue influence because a lot of people don't. And so thank you all for taking time and being a part of it. Certainly from USGA, we'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on these issues or anything else as well, as we're trying to do what we can to be able to make sure that we're carrying out the wishes of the American public and certainly Congress as it provides some of the legislation that we work with.
And I'm going to ask you for one more thing before we actually thank the panelists for this. And we're doing actually a poll for the EU. So if you don't mind taking your phones out, I know that in general we always say no phones while you are in a seminar or at school. But in this case, if you can, please do that. And if you go to www.slido.com, and then the password or the code, it will be IFPRI-EU, IFPRI-EU. And it's only 3 questions, very simple, but it will definitely help us and also the European Union delegation that is here to work on these seminars and maybe learn something from this. So if you don't mind doing that, I will give you a couple of minutes to do this before we say our goodbyes. All right, I think that most of you are done, so I would like to thank you one more time for being here and thank our speakers and panelists, and of course the EU delegation for co-hosting this event with us. It was definitely a pleasure. And if you're still interested in learning a little bit more about the U.S. agricultural policy, please join us in 2 days, so Wednesday, same time, same place, for looking at the U.S. policy in this rate. That's the name of the seminar. Thank you very much.